Hello and welcome to this interview. I am Professor Richard Murphy of Sheffield University Management School, but much more importantly, for the purposes of today, I am a columnist on the national newspaper, and I am undertaking a series of interviews with leading politicians in Scotland from all the major pro-independence parties who have an economics brief that they hold for their party. So today I'm talking to Neale Hanvey, who was, of course, MP for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, I think.
Cowdenbeath, yep.
I thought I was right, and I was going from memory there. Suddenly thought I should check that before I started. But anyway, I'm glad I got it right. Neale was, of course, representing Alba, and he's standing for election again. Welcome, Neale.
Yes. Hi, Richard. Lovely to see you.
Neale, let's jump straight in. Where are we economically as far as you are concerned? How do you see the world right now?
Well, I think we're stuck in an economic model that works on a narrative that makes various assumptions about the need to pay down debt and punish, if you like, public service funding as a consequence of that, and where the lion's share of wealth generation is siphoned off by large corporate interests at, very attractive rates, and where the public purse is called on to bail those same corporate interests out to make sure that their profit margins and shareholders are looked after, rather than a real focus on the prosperity in its broadest sense of the population of not just the constituent countries of the UK, but globally. I think it's a real problem, and that has driven a huge inequality between the poorest and the uber wealthy, the super wealthy, and the elite, and it's a real problem because it's the narrative that needs to be fixed rather than tinkering around with the structures that have been put in place to feed that beast.
Okay, that puts you, well, quite firmly, if I'm honest, on the left of the political agenda. As far as I can see it. I don't think I'm wrong there. And you are clearly, obviously, significantly concerned about issues like inequality, but also, therefore, the structure of the Scottish economy. Now, let's be honest, we both know you are not going to be in government in Westminster, whatever happens on July the 4th. Because that's not possible. You haven't got enough candidates to do that. So whatever happens, you're going to be in a minority position representing this view if you return to Westminster. How do you use that minority position to influence this big debate that you're talking about here for the benefit of the people of Scotland? What is your way of achieving that impact?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult for anybody, even within the governing party, to have any significant influence, because I think one of the challenges that we face in terms of economic policy is the buy-in to that centrist or right of centre narrative from all of the political parties. And I think what we've already been warned from Keir Starmer repeatedly is that there would be very little, if any, change in the economic policies between the outgoing government and an incoming Starmer administration. And so even within the party of government, the opportunity to challenge that paradigm and to address things like national monopolies, like water supply down south, and nationalising monopolies such as that, I think it's going to be very difficult. I think the real pressure has to come from the grassroots, if I'm honest, because I don't think the politicians generally are in tune with the very difficult life experiences of people at the lower strata. So, and I'm not just talking about, the underclass, people who are barely getting by on benefits, in an increasingly punitive marketplace where it seems to be, rather than welfare, more punishment for not being a productive member of society, whether that's because of ill health or disability. People are really struggling. But there's also the working poor, so people who are on very limited income but are working huge amounts of hours and having to go to food banks and the like. And then there's the what used to be called the just about managing middle class, if you like. Even they are absolutely struggling. I've been to many households where both parents and some of their children are working, and they still struggle to make ends meet for the basic necessities. Now, that to me speaks to a society that's absolutely lost sight. And when you hear Keir Starmer talk about, the Osborne type economic model of paying down the debt, which is, as you well know, is a fallacy, because there isn't a debt to be paid down as such. It really is disheartening. They don't seem to have a grasp on the basic fundamentals of what could be achieved if they had a bit of ambition, a bit of courage to challenge that overarching narrative, the globalist kind of corporate narrative.
Neale, you've already actually taken quite a number of my questions and embraced them. And I'm not worried about that. I like that, because you've addressed the issue that clearly there is an artificial constraint that is being imposed here by what I would call the English parties, fundamentally, who are choosing to say there is no money left. And I don't think it's any secret to any national reader that I would agree with you about that. Of course, there is money left. And therefore, obviously, the role of anyone who's challenging this government, but frankly, one that would be formed by the Liberal Democrats or by the Tories, if either ever get to office again, would be to challenge that idea. But let's just stand back for a moment, because obviously anybody who's in a party like yours has a dual agenda. You're standing for Westminster, but clearly what you're really interested in is an independent Scotland. And what you really want to do is run a government in Scotland. Now, let's suppose that when Scotland gets independence, and I think that's a when, not an if, when Scotland gets independence and it arrives in a situation where this situation is the same, because Keir Starmer, his successor, whoever the leader of the Tories might be, then whatever somebody's made a mess of, heaven forbid, Farage, has arrived on the scene, and they've left Scotland with an inheritance that is like this. What would you do then? If you had the real opportunity to come in and say, this is how I would change things for Scotland, given that this mess existed, what would you do?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to change the narrative. You have to divorce yourself from the briefings of organisations like the IFS, who predict that, Scotland becomes independent. It would be 10 years of austerity. You would have to constrain costs and the like. And there are very meaningful ways to challenge that. I mean, what frustrates me is we're in that transition period where there's a strong national movement towards independence, and what I think should be happening in Scotland now is not happening. So the first thing I would do if I had a say is to change the narrative in Scotland as it stands, because you've got to lay the groundwork for a different economic model for the future. So things that I would be fighting hard for is to build infrastructure projects that deliver jobs and supply chain, so manufacturing jobs, supply chain jobs already. And so there have been some brilliantly missed opportunities. So, for example, when the BiFab yard went up for sale in Burnt Island in Methil a couple of years ago, I managed to source, working with contacts, I managed to source an American engineering firm who were looking for a yard of the Methil size. They had financial backing. They were ready to go. They were very interested. They had a novel approach to jacket construction, and that was the right yard for them. I managed to get all of that information, put them in contact through Callum McKagan to Nicola Sturgeon's office. That went to Deloitte, and Deloitte sold the yard to Harland and Wolff, who have closed it down. And all of the few jobs that were left are now gone. So you've got to be imaginative and creative in the now before you start building for the future. And if you can't get those basic manufacturing jobs and attract that inward investment and make it attractive for business, then you're already at a disadvantage. And then the second criticism that I would make of now is the fiscal framework that was agreed by the Scottish Government and the UK Government that has this perverse mechanism within it that if you don't match the economic output and growth of London and the South East, very, very difficult thing to do, then you are penalised in the funding for public services. And if you overspend on public services, the mechanism reduces the funding that you receive. And so I think caving into that kind of doctrine is wrong. So I would want to fix some of those structural problems that exist now. And then I would be much more creative about how we release the opportunity of independence, because independence, I mean, if you go to the IFS study that said that independence would result in 10 years of austerity, that's only true if you follow the doctrine that the IFS set out. It's not true if you adopt a different economic model that capitalizes on investing in infrastructure, in wealth generation through that cyclical or circular taxation, where the more jobs you create, the more people you take off the dole queue, the more tax receipts you get, the faster your economic model or your economy can grow. Yeah, and so more of a Keynesian type model of economics rather than the Chicago boys,
But can I come back to one key assumption which I think the IFS made above all else, which was that Scotland would not have its own currency in effect, and that it would need 10 years to create the reserves to have its own currency after independence. And this obviously has been a big issue for the whole of the independence debate. Now, obviously, we are discussing here a general election which, frankly, has not got independence in it as far as the English parties are concerned. They can hardly be bothered to mention devolution. They can hardly be bothered to mention Scotland. I mean, I've read the Labour Party manifesto, and it manages less than a page of its 130 odd pages and 35 pictures of Keir Starmer, manages only a short reference to Scotland, which seems to me disproportionate. But let's suppose that that was on the agenda. Would there be an independent Scottish currency as soon as possible if you were to have that power to deal with the problems that Scotland now faces as an economy?
Yes, and I think that's an absolute must do. I don't think there's any doubt in that. No country establishes itself as an independent nation and doesn't move vigorously towards its own currency. I think that it only makes sound economic sense to do that. I think that's just a given.
Okay, and can we take that as a given? Can I move on to another one then? And move back to something which is perhaps more realistically on the agenda, because a Scottish independent currency is not going to be on the agenda. Nobody's going to give a Section 30 notice in the next 5 years, I fear. But the devolution settlement, and you've criticised it, and I would agree with many of your criticisms, I will be candid. But obviously, one of the big problems within the devolution settlement is the way in which tax was devolved. Extremely partially, extremely inadequately, in the sense it was almost as if the Parliament in Holyrood was being set up to fail on taxation issues. And there's been this enormous taboo in this election that you cannot possibly mention raising a tax anywhere. Tax is the terrible word. Well, it isn't actually for the minority parties. Let's be totally honest. In the debates that we've seen, it's clear that parties who are not in the lead, unless in particular, say, the Tories and Labour, then those parties are willing to talk about increasing taxes. Suppose you could get more taxing powers and negotiate those by being in Westminster. What would you be trying to get? And what would you do with them in Scotland? Two parts to that question. What do you want? What would you then do?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious thing to go after are things that are not taxed. So particularly things like capital gains tax is probably my first target. Now, you have to be, I guess, careful in the early days of an independent country that you don't scare off,
Well, let's assume we're not even in an independent country here, by the way. Let's assume that we're actually working between Holyrood inside the current devolution settlement and the rest of the UK, and that Holyrood has got itself more taxing powers. So let's assume we haven't got to the stage of independence yet, but you could actually negotiate a transfer of more powers. And so you've mentioned capital gains tax. So you obviously want capital gains tax to go to Scotland.
Yes.
What would you then do if we were working inside the existing UK settlement, but with extra taxing powers for capital gains and whatever else you want?
Well, I'll give you one clear example of where I think some of the problems lie. So I think capital gains is one thing that I would like to see generally. I think it's only appropriate that money earned, however it's earned, is taxed the same as income tax, because that's what it is, it's income. So I would advocate for that. Secondly, I think we have been far too timid in land reform, and we have actually enabled some of the real problems, the fundamental problems with the current situation with land. So some of the peatlands have been rehabilitated at great expense to the Scottish Government's budget. And what that's actually enabled is that rich landowners to then sell access to that land or carbon rights to that land at vastly inflated profits on the global markets to offset carbon targets for large corporations. Now, that money from public money investment to rehabilitate the land, those profits should be coming back into the revenue stream for the Scottish Government or into, renewable sector or other environmental sector budgets. And, you could come up with different vehicles that could receive those revenues so that could be then invested back into, other projects that would provide employment and economic activity and assist lifting people out of poverty. And I guess the other part of what I would do if I had a wish list would be to really meaningfully tackle poverty, because the real problem with poverty is not, small incremental uplifts to a supposed living wage. It's about how do you address that gross imbalance between the most wealthy, well-off paid, so your CEOs and the like, and those on the lowest salaries. And if I again use another example, so when the Labour Party last came into power at the end of the 90s, I was working in the NHS, and there was a massive shift in the pay scales in the NHS. Now, sometimes that was pretty good. So, clinical staff saw a significant uplift in their pay, but the pay spines as you went up in seniority became increasingly big. And, there were people like myself actually found that we were getting paid much more than we ever imagined we would work in the NHS. And that wasn't really a motivating factor for us going there. But above that clinical pay spine, those in senior management roles and chief executives of NHS trusts started to receive extraordinary amounts of money, 200, 300, 400,000 pounds for a job running a hospital. And we've seen that again in the education sector, particularly in universities, where the most senior members of university staff are getting eye-watering amounts of money. And that just can't be right in public services. I think that is an obvious imbalance that needs to be constrained. But outside that, in the corporate world, the disparity between the lowest pay and the highest is even greater. So there needs to be some mechanism that addresses that disparity, because, how much money does somebody need to squirrel away? And I think I watched something that you had posted on YouTube a couple of weeks ago about that savings actually are useless. They're but it's a huge amount of savings. That's just dead money sitting there, not actually doing anything active within the economy. And it's much better to have people in the lowest paid jobs with enough money that they want to spend it and keep the economy active. And at the moment, we don't have that.
Can I just come back to a couple of points you raised there? Because I think they're really interesting and actually are a marked difference between where you are and maybe where others are. You mentioned the NHS and you want it back under effectively full government control. And you mentioned the universities and you effectively want them under full government control. Yeah. You believe in the power of government to deliver something that is good as a result. Is that right?
Well, I believe that people go into, I was motivated to go into the NHS for reasons that didn't involve making lots of money. I always knew when I entered the NHS that I was that it wasn't really about the money. I wanted to have a decent living, and there were periods where I didn't really get that, and periods where I did. But the motivation's different, and so I think the idea that you need to attract the best, that you pay these wages to attract the highest caliber of person into the job. I think that's a false assumption. I think you get the best people if they're motivated because they're creative and ambitious about delivering the role rather than about accumulating personal wealth and status. So I think there's a false assumption.
We've got relatively limited time, Neale, so I'm going to move us on to another question if I can.
Okay.
Oil. This is an issue which is coming up in debate. It's obviously central to much of debate over the last 50 years or more in Scottish economics. Where are you? Why are you? What is the reason for your policy?
Well, our position is that North Sea oil and gas still is an important commodity. It's an important element of our vast natural wealth, particularly around energy, but not unique. We have wind, tidal, and wave energy all available to us as well. So lots of renewable. But oil and gas is important for a variety of different reasons going forward, and will always be so. But we have to do that responsibly. So our position is that we would introduce a wellhead tax, if you like, that would maximize investment into carbon capture and storage. And we have one of the largest banks for carbon in the North Sea. And although the market for carbon is not really profitable at the moment, I think we're missing a trick, and we should have been doing this at least over the last 5 years, if not the last 10 years, in developing the pipeline between key strategic sites. So in my constituency at Musmoran, and just along the way at Grangemouth, between St Fergus, where we would be able to pipe carbon up the way and use that as a proof of concept, if you like, and get ready for a time, because there will come a time when carbon can be traded at a profit on the international markets. And we have an absolutely enormous resource in the North Sea that would bring in a vast amount of investment and employment into Scotland. So not only would we be able to continue to exploit the oil and gas for specific markets, sometimes in energy, but also in high quality plastics and the like from the ethylene plants. So there is still life in North Sea oil and gas, and a presumption against exploitation presupposes that there isn't a way to fix some of the negative aspects of continued use of fossil derivatives. So I think there needs
this is going to run alongside. This is going to run alongside a green policy, then.
Well, yes, absolutely. I think we've got to be responsible with the environment. That I think should be an ambition, whatever the case. But we have to accept that there is a place for North Sea oil and gas, and will be, in terms of fuel security and energy security going forward.
But some people are certainly going to say that's a circle you can't square. Do you accept that, or obviously you don't? Why not?
No, I don't accept that. I think that, you can't square it if you don't invest in it. And if you close down the very engineering expertise, so Grangemouth, Musmoran, and all of the offshore activity, if you close that down without a proper plan in place, then there can't be a transition. So you need to retain and develop the engineering expertise across the sector so that you can move at pace, but more importantly, start implementing some of the environmental projects into the mix in a much more meaningful way. And the UK government have been absolutely hopeless over the last 5 years. I mean, Kenny, myself, and others have been pushing for investment at the Acorn project throughout this time. And I think there was a resistance to that because it was in Scotland. And that's very unfortunate. But that tells its own story about the imbalances within the union.
Right. To close, because we want to keep these to within half an hour for everybody's sake. And every party is going to get, I hope, near enough the same number of minutes. A series of quick fire questions to close. And I'm going to ask everybody pretty much the same questions. So these ones are virtually yes or no's, I hope.
Okay.
The UK national debt, does it need to be repaid?
No.
I thought that was what you'd say. You'd already hinted at that. At what rate of interest do you think the Bank of England should be setting base rates at present?
Oh, well, I'm not an economist, so I probably would be hazarding a guess. I think a reduction of about 0.5% would be helpful to stimulate the economy. But as I say, I would come to someone like you for the answer to that question.
Fair enough. A more conceptual question regarding the Bank of England, which would of course apply to a Central Bank of Scotland if it was to have one. Should it be independent of government, or should it be directly reporting to government?
Well, it depends what that independence actually means. So if independence from government means at the behest of corporate entities, then that's a slightly more complicated question. So I think the relationship with government is very important if you're going to have a cohesive economic strategy that you can actually work together on. I think some degree of independence is useful, but what it can't be is a servant to the markets or a servant to corporate interests.
Okay. A question about independence effectively, but potentially about what could happen within the Holyrood environment if the corporation tax rate was devolved to Scotland. Should Scotland use lower corporation tax rates to lure business into Scotland? Should it become a tax haven?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And if you look across to the Baltic states, that's certainly a model that they adopted with great success. I think that there needs to be some kind of plan about how you do attract inward investment. And the question is really around, is your workforce and resources attractive enough of a proposition to lure them in anyway? But if you're going to be starting new activity in a new country, you're going to have to start off with some kind of attractive package to bring people in. And I think what you have to do then is be honest about any stratification of those rates once the economy starts to grow. And there are different ways that you can look at deriving economic income and revenue streams from that activity without necessarily using corporation tax. I think it's all about being flexible.
To stay within time, however, I think I've got sort of an ambiguity there, if I can be honest with you.
Yes.
Three which I really think are yes, no's, and I don't think you'll have problems with. Land value tax, yes or no?
Yes.
A wealth tax, yes or no?
Not as it's currently described, no. I favour more the corporate capital gains as a wealth tax.
Increased taxes on the wealthy then,
Yes.
That's the final question, Neale. We've done our half an hour together. Thank you so much. That was, I think, illuminating. I hope people find this interesting. Thank you for joining us on The National, taking the time out, because I no doubt you're pretty busy right now.
Yes,
good
indeed.
luck with your campaign, and let's see what happens on July the 4th. But right now, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Richard. A pleasure.